I don't think you have a home, dude.
And so you are disabled insofar as you can't contribute to the market.
This is a problem that society has not been able to have the sort of will to solve.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Owls at Dawn. We are just two dudes from Southern California who studied philosophy, politics, and religion around the world and decided to start a podcast where we could bullshit with impunity. I am Austin Hayden Smith.
And he remembered.
Yes, he did.
I am Troy Polidori.
And this week we're going to be talking about a very interesting article that Troy sent me about having a Down syndrome baby. So we'll probably talk about disability studies, the value of life, etc., things relating to that. And then we have a special sticky leaves this week, I'm going to say, because it's this article that Troy sent me about the problem with reactionary fascism that has embedded itself within the metal world, when metal used to not be that way. It used to be this transgressive art, and it's this pretty long essay. So we'll probably split our time between our main segment and the Sticky Leaves segment. But, of course, before we do that, we got some other shit to get into.
Yeah, I mean, aren't every Sticky Leaves special, just by definition? Isn't that the point?
I thought it was the mundanity, like the banality of it is special. So it becomes special only in the subjective experience of the banal.
Oh, you have to, like, activate the speciality yourself?
Yeah, it's all about agency. It's pure, agential orientation, transforming the banality of the sticky leaves, which is just, the leaves on a fucking summer day or fall day or spring day or whatever the fuck it is that he's talking about. They're only special in your shift in orientation to the leaf.
That sounds to me like a very 20th century existentialist reading of Dostoevsky.
Duh.
Which is exactly what you would do. So.
Duh.
Before we do any of that, though, we got to go to our shitty minutes. This is the part of the show where one of us rants for a minute, usually about 5 times longer than that, about whatever it is that's been grinding our gears since the last episode, which has been a lot of gear grinding, if that's the case, because it's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while.
So, Austin, what's been getting you?
Well, so here's the thing. Mine's going to be a little bit more jovial. There are all kinds of things. I could be angry about Russiagate. I could be angry about, rising inequality. I could be angry about the degradation of the environment. I mean, there are so many things that you could potentially rant about. But I just relocated to Sydney, Australia, and I'm going to rant not about what actually I was just talking with Troy about prior to recording, which is the fact that there are just crazy animals here and bugs here that they all want to kill you. But
you don't call demons animals. Those are 2 different natural kind terms. Just putting that out there.
Troy had never seen the weird flying bat foxes that they have here. So I told him to Google that shit. And he's like, this is a demon. This is literally a demon. So if you do not know out there, Google Australia flying bat fox, and you will see what we're talking about. But no.
I mean, do you remember the medieval depictions of Satan?
That's exactly what it looks like.
They literally look like these foxes. Literally. They are the same thing.
Yeah, I wonder if there was ever sort of like any influence. Like that's how the stories came up through, like, the local Aboriginal peoples that went up through into, I don't know, Papua New Guinea, into like Indonesia, and then somehow they kind of like found its way into ancient Mesopotamia, and that's where these stories came from. I wonder. I don't know. Or maybe they migrated this way when people came. I don't know how that all works, because fuck, man, my world geography is not going to be all that great. But, there has to be some sort of sense.
I used to think that the European colonialists were totally racist when they would go to these new areas and basically think that the Aboriginals and native people were summoning the devil. But they literally had demons around them. So maybe it was just a mistake in, like, correlation equals causation or something.
I think you're right. That must be what it is.
It was like guilt by association or something.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they're like, dude, what are you talking about? That's a snack. We eat the flying bat foxes. You don't have to be afraid of it. Don't worry about that. But, the white Europeans, they weren't used to that because they don't have flying bat foxes in France. All right, that's not what my shitty minute's about. My shitty minute is about the problem with Sydney, Australia, so far, from what I can surmise, is that it is a strange combination between Great Britain and Los Angeles. So rather than being situated in either domain, it is a hybrid. It is the social awkwardness that you get from British people mixed with the superficiality that you get in the Hollywood industry or the beach communities in Los Angeles. And what that means for me is that I think I'm going to perpetually be out of place because I think that is me, but I'm not used to being in that world. Because one, I don't really do social awkwardness, but like I can hang out with people that are British, and I lived in the UK for, I guess adding up all of my stints, almost 6 years. But I can totally settle, which maybe that's why I actually enjoyed Scotland more so than England, because they are a little bit less socially awkward. They don't really, they still get the social awkwardness, but they're a little bit more down to earth. They're a little bit less kind of closed off from each other. They're a little bit more community based. So they don't really have the kind of, the way that people think of it, like, oh, British people don't access your emotions, just stuff it down. And, they're kind of weird when they're in social encounters in a situation that might cause some sort of tension. I think you get that more in England than in Scotland. And since I spent more time in Scotland, I didn't deal with it too much. A little bit, but not too much. And then, of course, I'm from Southern California, and I lived in LA most recently from like 2014 to beginning of 2016 or middle of 2016, whatever it was. So then I also have that side of me. But Sydney is like this weird combination of the two. It's like people are socially awkward, and at the same time they're aspiring to be like Los Angeles famous and rich. And that I think that's going to be really weird for me. I think I'm going to be perpetually displaced. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like basically everybody in Australia is like John Oliver.
Yeah, except better looking.
Like an awkward English dude who's just somehow become famous.
Except that because they've become famous or in their pursuit of fame, they're not as awkward. Like he is the quintessential, this is what an awkward guy is who's thrust into the limelight. That's not quite what it is here. This is like literally... So when you go to Sydney's divided up into these little regions. You've got like the Bondi, Coogee region, which is the beach area. Manly, that's the beach. It's a lot of money. That's like our Venice and Santa Monica. Okay, that's like Venice, Santa Monica, Playa del Rey, Marina del Rey, stuff like that. And then you've got the inner west, which is where I live, which is more like Silver Lake, Los Feliz area. It's a little more artsy, a little hipstery. It's kind of gentrified. Middle-class people who kind of got pushed out here originally because of the art community and stuff like that, but now they're here and they're making craft beer bars and cool gypsy jazz clubs and shit like that, I go to this amazing bookstore. It's called Sappho Books. It might be my favorite place in the fucking world, but it's a secondhand bookstore that has a cafe in the back that turns into a bar after 5 o'clock. Or 5:30, and they do like poetry readings on the second Tuesday of every month. They do live music most nights. It's a cool meetup place. It's fucking rad, man. I absolutely love it. So you have that world, and then you have like the beach world, and so the people are kind of, they navigate between these spaces, but maybe not fully embodying these spaces. Of course, you do get radical hipsters here, and then you do get kind of like the kind of typical Bondi person, I guess, super fit, super cares about their appearance, dresses well, has a lot of money, is all about like kind of like what we would consider more the superficial concerns. So you do get those tropes or those stereotypes, but I would say the average thing that I can say about this culture is it's weird hybrid between the two. And it's very strange because I feel like I get that hybrid, but I'm not quite that hybrid,
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm kind of wondering if this is like one of those things where self-diagnosis just goes awry. Because, maybe we can ask other people, but I don't really see you that way. The way I would see you, having known you for going on, about 12 years now, is that you're the rare extrovert who kind of has disdain for superficiality. Even though you could probably slip into that when you want to, like every time you're listening to Joe Rogan or something,
right?
It's like putting on an old, an old suit or something. Like it just fits perfectly.
Yes.
But that's the thing that makes me think that you always kind of seem a little out of place, is because you're able to like be a chameleon and and fit in with any kind of conversation that exists comfortably, but then you want depth out of it, and most people just don't give a shit.
Yes. Yeah, that might
So
be
yeah,
right.
I don't think you have a home, dude. That's the problem. I think everywhere
Yeah.
you go, you're gonna have something that's an area of confluence, but you're always gonna be missing something.
Yeah, you know what's weird? I would say the topography of Sydney is very comfortable to me. I've got the beach. I've got this kind of hipster area with these amazing bars and amazing restaurants and amazing bookshops and this amazing university and stuff like that. And the university is actually different because, you know, the people that are in the department where I'm researching are all fucking awesome. But that's just because it's that nerd. We can nerd out together, right? So nothing else matters at that point because we're just kind of we cohere around our ability to geek out. But in terms of like the various locales and neighborhoods, I totally fit in. But socially, it has been interesting, and I have noticed it. Like, yeah, I still hang out with people and whatnot, but I have noticed a little bit. I'm kind of like, I just don't quite get you guys yet. I haven't figured it out.
That sounds like hell for me, but like a nice challenge for you.
Well, so like the guy that I'm closest with so far here is actually an English guy, and he's like this weird esoteric artist, romantic English guy. So like, of course we're going to be drawn together because he's this weird musician artist that works as like a consultant in bars for trying to help people stimulate or match the ambiance of their bar. It's like an entire aesthetic experience, the ambiance of their bar with the cocktails and drinks that they serve. So he's just like this hedonist artist philosopher guy. And so yeah, we vibe together.
Are you sure this isn't your like Mr. Hyde?
He is. He's like he is. That's basically, yeah, probably, you know. But yeah, when I hang out with the actual Aussies that I've met, and I've spent considerable time with a few of them, I'm kind of like, I'm still not there yet. You might be right. Maybe I'm just destined to be a homeless vagabond, in a home without a home, or I don't know.
I think you kind of like that though.
I do.
Like maybe that is your comfort space.
Yeah,
You ever think about
comfortable with
that shit?
discomfort.
Yeah, man. That's meta.
It's meta. Yeah, I used to be like all wanky and bullshitty with students sometimes, and I would say if you can get comfortable with discomfort, that's a good thing. Or shit like fall in love with the process, blah blah blah. You know, I'm all about that.
You know what I can't wait for?
What is
When some 5'11" skinny blonde like snags you, and then she's like a adventurer out in the outback, and then you just become like a wild crazy man.
I mean, I feel like I could see myself doing that, like go roo hunting or something like that, and chasing flying demon foxes.
I mostly just want to get like first person iPhone camera shots of these flying foxes. So
is
we're
that
going to
what-
need to like figure out a way to make that happen.
All right, so 5'11" skinny blondes who also have an adventurous spirit in Australia. Hit me up. Austin_Twitter. Austin_Twitter. Austin_Hayden on Twitter. All right, cool. Let's transition into our main segment. So we were trying to figure out what to chat about this week. It's been a little bit of time since our last episode. And I mean, there's so much that's gone on politically, culturally, socially. But, you know, Troy and I never really want to kind of just sit in the cliche cultural shit that's going on. We don't want to talk about like Russiagate.
Everything that's happened has been stupid, basically, is what we're saying. So we're not going to talk about it.
Exactly. And then at the same time, we don't want to like just, I don't know, do like deep dives into technical, wanky, philosophical shit necessarily. So we're trying to figure out something that's topical and interesting, but where we could maybe do like a little bit of a deep dive. So Troy found this really cool article that he sent over, or I should say a really interesting article, a thought-provoking article. And I figured I'd kick it over to Troy and let him explain a little bit about the article and the author's position.
Yeah, so the article is from Chris Kaposi, I think is how you pronounce it. He's a professor of philosophy at Memorial University in Canada. He wrote in the New York Times this article called "The Ethical Case for Having a Baby with Down Syndrome." And it's a pretty short article, not super in-depth, just a real basic argument, bringing up the idea that babies with Down syndrome, as we continue to increase our abilities in screening technology, may become a thing of the past. We'll be able to selectively sort of breed out Down syndrome and the genetic factors that correlate with it. And Kaposi here is arguing that we shouldn't necessarily do that. At the very least, we should have a discussion over whether or not a person's life when they have Down syndrome is actually has a deficit or is lacking in anything, as it is normally thought. And I thought it was really interesting. Not that I have any experience with it, not that I'm a bioethicist, but I do know that Austin has had some experience working or studying in disability studies. And so I know he's had some things to say about this issue in the past that I thought were pretty thought-provoking. So I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about a little bit on the podcast and maybe see if we can come up with any ideas that would be worth having. Yeah. I also know that there's been some recent hubbub about what's happening in Iceland. And I know I was in Iceland last year, and there was a little bit of talk about this while we were there. That Iceland has a 99%, I believe, even rounding up to, I think, 100%, rate of aborting fetuses with Down syndrome of the mothers who have been screened, which I think is like 80% of mothers. So I believe it's about 2 or 3 babies with Down syndrome are born every year now in the entire island. So they've almost entirely eradicated Down syndrome from the Icelandic population. And it's really interesting to think about because some people react to that, obviously, as you would think, and say that it's the worst possible thing you can imagine. And then you talk to Icelanders and it's like, well, this is kind of wonderful. Like, no one has to go through life with that syndrome, nor do they have to watch their loved ones go through it or in their old age have to care for somebody with Down syndrome, which can cause a lot of unnecessary suffering, they would argue. So all that said, contextually, I thought it was a pretty interesting issue we might be able to talk about.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, because both of us come out of the evangelical world or the theological world. You know, that position would just automatically balk at this, would just knee-jerk reaction. This is wrong. It is a destruction of the sort of imago Dei, right? The image of God. The value of life is infinite, and it's our responsibility to care for the value of life or something along those lines. So in the Christian community, I think I met a lot of people that either had non-neurotypical or disabled children, whether it was like physical handicaps or, as I said, some sort of cognitive impairment, and or as is more appropriate, some cognitive difference, right? And it's a terminology they like to use in disability studies, right? It's this idea of multiple differences rather than trying to use the language of normality. So it would be non-neurotypical is a technical term that is often used. And in the Christian circles, such individuals were always treated with a sort of, I think it was a veiled pity that was disguised as a sort of appreciation or valuing of the sort of infinite measure of value that is intrinsic to human life. But it kind of always seemed like, you know, that there was a focus on the specialness of the person with special needs, and that then there was a sort of virtue that referred back to the parents, where it was like, oh my God, you were doing God's work in taking care of this child. And I think there's something problematic with that. Obviously, I think it's a bit insidious. I think there is this strange sort of nihilism in the Nietzschean sense that sort of that this child is a means to an end, that you're not actually affirming this child intrinsically, despite what you might think to the contrary, but that rather you're appreciating this child as a means in this world to sort of score points in heaven, or to kind of articulate yourself as a good Protestant, or to prove that you really are a saved one in the sort of Protestant work ethic sense, something along those lines. The point is that there's like an instrumental care for such a person that I find quite problematic. I mean, would you say that you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. I think that position that views the person with a disability, or in this case, non-neurotypical, as being sort of a plant by God to test oneself and to see how committed one is as a steward. Yeah. It's basically, there's no difference between viewing the non-neurotypical person in nature in that theology, in the sense of being a steward. And that relegates a human being to a thing. And while it may be well intentioned, because the people often who have kids with Down syndrome, they care deeply for these kids, and they honestly do. But then this theological language really doesn't place this person as a subject who can have experiences and have a fulfilling life. And maybe they can have those things as accidents, but that's certainly not the subject of the discussion. And that seems very problematic to me as well.
Yeah, that's it. It's that turn between the subject and the object. They are an object to be cared for rather than actually trying to figure out different forms of subjectivization that would allow a person that might not fit in the current social schema, how we can allow that person to have a greater experience or a greater development of subjectivity.
Yeah, and to add on to that, there's also, I think, from the other side, an argument that needs to be dealt with, which is, are there some cases where an individual's suffering is so great that it is actually an act of mercy to not be alive anymore? And that's a really complicated question when you're talking about a fetus, obviously. I think it's less complicated when you're talking about other areas. Maybe we can analogize from there. So I know
you mean like a terminal disease or something?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You know that I've had experiences with that were pretty deeply traumatic and effective to my own life. Seeing, an individual who was brain dead and was unable to have his life terminated for legal reasons. And that really, I think, kind of radicalized me a little bit in terms of not even just that person suffering, but the people around, and that the suffering that can be caused from that, and the lack of any sort of meaningful experience the person can have, given that they're brain dead or whatever it is. There just seems to me no consideration of that seems incredibly just disaffected, and I don't even know what to say to it. It seems like it's delusional to view some sort of theological principle over and above the immense suffering that's right in front of you. Now, that said, the question I think is there an analogy there between that and the person with Down syndrome? Because I think that's the argument that people make. Like when you talk about the Icelandic situation, the analogy they make is there will be suffering, there will be a lack of meaningful experience with the kid with Down syndrome, and therefore it's not worth making that a potential life. And I don't know that I agree with that. In fact, I think the more I think about it, the more I disagree with that analogy. And I'd be interested to hear what you say about that, because I know you've had much more experience with this.
Do you disagree with it because it seems to be a sort of paternalistic concern rather than, again, a sort of bottom-up concern? So it's what I wonder is if there's a problem ultimately of communication here. So somebody with Down syndrome is obviously able to articulate certain measures of suffering, and there are instances of people communicating their experience as someone that's existing a bit on the margins of society. But is there a sense in which the Icelandic position seems to presume to know how that person is suffering, but really who's suffering is that there's like a perceived drain on society? Is that kind of the concern? Rather than actually, whereas like someone who's brain dead, somebody who's actually suffering, somebody who has a terminal disease that is literally putting them in an immense amount of pain every single day. The difference is that person can say, I am literally fucking suffering and I don't want to suffer anymore. Please let me just get away from this pain literally day after day. And can we make that bridge to, somebody that has Down syndrome?
Yeah, I think that the subjective aspect of it is clearly disanalogous because, like you just said, the person who's at end of life and is suffering has a positive experience. Not positive in the sense of good, but positive in the sense of existing experience. Whereas the argument for the person with Down syndrome is that they have a lack. They have a deficit of meaningful experience. So it's not suffering as much as it is a deficit of what we consider to be positive in the good sense, good, meaningful experience. And that seems to me totally disanalogous because people with Down syndrome are perfectly capable of having meaningful experiences for themselves and bringing happiness and joy to themselves and to the people around them. So that seems to me clearly disanalogous. Maybe the social impact factor might be more analogous in that you could argue that it affects the people around them. So the person who's 65 years old needs to retire, their body's falling apart slowly but surely, and they have to care for their 35-year-old son or daughter with Down syndrome, and it's creating a huge toll on them. I think that's also wrong too, though, because, I mean, just empirically, people who have kids with Down syndrome do not report, as far as I can tell, any deficit in their relationship with that person. Maybe they do have a toll in their lives from having to care for this person, but I don't think that they would give it up for that reason, certainly. And also, that seems to me to say much more about the social dynamics than it does about the interpersonal dynamics. This is a problem that society has not been able to have the sort of will to solve, rather than an issue about individuals and their experience.
Yeah, because then we'd need to assess, so why is there a drain on the carer? And then we need to think of, okay, what if the drain on the carer only exists because we have a society that doesn't care for carers, doesn't view their labor as valuable labor, doesn't pay them, doesn't compensate them, so this person ends up becoming a sort of free laborer for the reproduction of, the system, so to speak. And then you might say, oh, but maybe the child isn't producing for the market, so how is this fit in with sort of the idea of reproducing? But nevertheless, that child is a consumer. That child is consuming food. That child is consuming, electricity by sitting in a room, and that child could eventually go into the workforce. So yeah, they can produce for the market, maybe not to the same extent that, some other individual working in a manufacturing plant will, but maybe. But then again, this all goes to the point of the system in which we live isn't structured in a way that allows for such individuals to flourish. And that's really the ultimate problem, is we don't have a system that takes care of carers, of people who do care work, and then we also don't have services that allow for maybe a parent or an aunt or a grandmother to kind of have a break every once in a while, where we have professional carers or we have community centers that can allow for such persons, again, to be able to go and be in an environment where they can have community that doesn't put an unnecessary drain on family or friends. And yeah, of course, we have some community centers and there are some special needs programs, and those things are great. But the problem is they're not publicly owned for the most part in a broad sense, which means that a lot of them are kind of philanthropic endeavors, which is okay, I guess. At least there's something there, but it really minimizes the breadth that we need. We need this to be something that exists across society as a central foundational element of who we are. And it's not just caring for people with Down syndrome, it's caring for infants and children and single mothers and for the elderly. And we need to have these social support systems. Sometimes they're referred to as basic services, right? And generally when we think of basic services, we're thinking of education and healthcare. That's what we think of. But we have to think about care work and these community type of efforts that allow for there to be an alleviation of pressure, especially in a market society where people have so many pressures on them already to produce that doesn't allow them to be able to really dedicate themselves to these other pressing concerns that might be actually far more important when we actually think about what matters in terms of building a society. So we need to have a reorientation of our thinking about these social networks that, God, I shouldn't use that word because you're probably thinking now of internet social networks, and I don't mean that, the social network, but of these social systems, these social support systems, these basic services that will allow us to be able to care for all of the different members of a given collective. And that includes anyone from the elderly to the infant and anything in between in your stage of life, whether that means that you are a fully fit 25-year-old who doesn't need to support the support of care work, or whether that means that you are a child with Down syndrome or an adult with Down syndrome who might need a little bit of extra time and care to be able to kind of find his or her place within a field that really can actually benefit from that person's participation if we can only figure out how and in what ways that person can contribute.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree about that. And I think it's a pretty simple empirical question, actually, not even a philosophical question, that you can ask people who are in sort of social groupings with people with Down syndrome, whether they're friends or family or coworkers or whatever it is, and ask them, whatever toll that being around this person takes on you, if it indeed does take a toll at all, is it the person that's creating the toll, or is it the network and the environment that's the externality that's creating the toll? And I'm pretty sure that it's shown unequivocally that it's not the person. It's entirely the fact that I just don't have enough money. I just don't have enough time. I want to make this work, but other things are making it difficult. And that's where the struggle and the suffering comes in. It's not an intrinsic nature of one's experience. It's an external factor,
right?
Which is why it's, I think, disanalogous between the person who's suffering at the end of life.
I 100% agree. Yeah, I mean, have you ever, if you spent time around children with Down syndrome or children with special needs or adults with special needs, if you spent time with the non-neurotypical, there is a fucking joy that exists among so many of these individuals. Yes, I understand there's a hardship that we also need to recognize. We don't need to paint like this naive, idealistic picture. We need to recognize that certain individuals are, again, sometimes bullied. They do realize sometimes that they are different, and they look at people getting married sometimes, and they say, man, I want to get married. You know, I want to do those things. And so there is a level of self-reflexivity that can cause a measure of pain. But then again, all of the stuff that I'm talking about relates to the social systems that we've created that prevent such individuals from being integrated. And that is a serious problem. And I think that really one of the key problems is that the paradigm that structures capitalist society is ultimately this like law of the maximization of profit, right? Which is driven by this way in economics that we're so wedded to thinking about the laws of supply and demand. We're producers and we're consumers. That's the correlate to supply and demand, right? You produce for the market, you supply for the market, and then your demand leads to consumption of things. So, but I think that there needs to be a better way of kind of just thinking about what engagement in a society means. And I like to think of participation and contribution instead, or I guess contribution would be the correlate to production, and participation would be the correlate to consumption. So what can you contribute to your society that doesn't just simply exist within producing for the market? And then simultaneously, in what way do you participate in the economy, which just means the sort of administration of the household, right? That's what the word economy kind of means in its literal sense. And so in what way then do you participate in the household, you know? And when we think about it in that sense, it really changes the way that we even view what human life means in a society or in the polis, so to speak. And I think that these are some things that we need to kind of really think through and work through, is how can we transform the basic services? How can we build a social system that allows for difference to flourish? And how can we think then about our roles as subjects within the system through a different lens, not through production and consumption based on the laws of supply and demand, but rather through this idea of social cohesion through contribution and participation. And that to me is something that I think would really help us to kind of reframe even how we discuss this issue in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And you know, we can even kind of analogize this to bigger issues of technology in the first place, right? I mean, one of Kaposi's biggest points in the article is to say we're going to have the technology in terms of pregnancy screening, where this is going to be an extremely important question for us to address. So we need to start the conversation now. And that has to do with all technology. The technology is not good or evil intrinsically. It's in how it's used that can be good or evil. And when we don't have these questions and we don't discuss them beforehand, we end up with this like false naivete that either your Zuckerbergology, which is AI will solve everything and technology will just solve all of our problems, which of course usually ends up with technology kind of enslaving us, or being used solely for the sake of market production and massive inequality.
Right.
Or you have this false naivete on the other side, which is that technology is inherently evil and we need to go back to some Luddite past when it wasn't like this. And of course, there never was that Luddite utopian past. It never existed. And so it's really just kind of like an impatience with thinking. And both of those are obviously bad. They're polar opposites, but they're both wrong. And so having this discussion now, I think, even in an area as niche as Down syndrome and screening and things like this, is a helpful practice for other areas as well.
Yeah. I agree. So in the world of disability studies, there are kind of three dominant, I think, models that seem to frame this debate. One is called like the medical model of disability. One is called the social model of disability. And then I don't even know what you'd call the third one, but it's sort of like a radical expansion on the social model, and it basically argues the ubiquity of disability. And so the medical model of disability is the one that I think most people are probably familiar with. And it uses the language of normal and abnormal. And it's the idea that there is a normal functioning human body, and anything that fits within that, those parameters, which are rather kind of, I don't want to say rigid, but there's definitely a strict field of capacities and functions and characteristics that are required. And so it's quite a limited and limiting sort of paradigm. And then the social model comes along and it says, well, wait a second. Let's not view somebody that doesn't have a leg as disabled, but let's think about that person's only disabled because, we don't have a wheelchair ramp in our buildings, in all of our buildings. So we've built our buildings with stairs, which is actually really strange. Why didn't we just build fucking ramps everywhere? Why did we build stairs? And why didn't we make it so that humans can just walk up ramps? Like, literally, what is the point of fucking stairs? Why not ramps? Maybe it goes back to like the old weird, like, what is it, the ziggurats, the old pyramids, and you can go up a lot quicker with stairs than you can elevate a lot quicker with stairs than you can with a ramp.
It's way more badass to go down a slide.
It is way more, and it's not badass to go downstairs in the same way that you would go down a slide. That hurts. That shit hurts. So
you got to ride your ass on the railing like you did when you were in high school.
Oh yeah, dude. In high school I still do that. What are you talking about? Did you see the YouTube video or the video that went viral of the guy in the UK that was sliding down the center in the tubes, and he hits like the little stop gaps in the middle of? Oh. Did you see it? So he's sliding down backwards.
I've seen videos like that, yeah.
He's sliding down backwards, and his legs are open spread eagle, and it crushes his balls. And then he's like, oh, but then he keeps sliding because his momentum is so fast. And there's this other one, and he nails it, and he gets launched into the air, and he flies onto the other escalator that's going up in the other direction. And he just, like, eats shit, man. It's so bad. So bad. So maybe that's why people built stairs. So I get that. I get that. But the social model would argue, though, that again we've structured our society, we've built our streets and our sidewalks and our buildings in such a way that it fits within this kind of idea of normalcy that doesn't account for certain differences that do exist. Like they might be minority expressions of the human, but nevertheless they are essential characteristics of what it means to be human. There is a sort of difference of what it means to be human, and some people just happen to function differently. We act differently, we think differently, we walk differently, et cetera, et cetera. So then if we could create a society or a social system that was more embracing of these differences, that facilitated these differences, then that would help overcome this idea of disability. And then there's the kind of more radical idea, which is that it kind of takes that idea and it says, well, the problem with that is that it doesn't account for the fact that really everybody is disabled. It's not just the sort of because they think the social model is too based on the medical model, that it's still saying, oh, that those people are different, but the other people are still normal. So they say, no, actually, you know what? Everybody's disabled. Everybody's disabled. I am right now disabled from being able to jump onto my roof. So I can't do that, so what do humans do? We build ladders. Great. Well, I'm a quote-unquote normal or typical dude. I'm an athletic dude. I work out. I eat well. I'm relatively strong. And I still can't jump onto the fucking roof. So I need to build a goddamn ladder. Or I need to build a crane. Or we need to build a wheelbarrow because I'm not strong enough to carry like 17 bricks. Some motherfuckers can do that. They're more abled when it comes to the tasks. So this perspective would view that ability is something that only exists in relation to a task to be achieved. So I am disabled insofar as I can't jump on the roof, but I am able insofar that I can co-host a podcast, right? So when we think of it from this perspective, it really changes how we understand the entire debate about what a disabled person is, and then how we as a society ought to, one, view ourselves, which I think it humiliates individuals that kind of want to view themselves as being in this position of the able-bodied versus the disabled. So there's a measure of humility, I think, that is introduced into this. When I say humiliated, I mean that in like the technical sense of humility. So there's a humility that's introduced into this so that you don't become paternalistic and think like, oh, I'm the able-bodied and they're the disabled. And then at the same time, it also it reorients the way that we kind of view how the kind of non-neurotypical person fits within this schema. And then we realize the benefits that we've experienced as the quote-unquote able-bodied, the majority person that has been accepted in relation to the social systems that have allowed that person to flourish in their capacity in relation to the tasks that they're trying to achieve. So it takes the social model and it expands differently in a direction kind of away from the social model's still attachment to the medical model.
No, I think that's a very helpful way of thinking about it. And I think the key that I get from that third model that you're talking about, that's so much like a radical version of the social model and against the medical model, is that it makes it very clear to me that the market can't solve that problem.
Right.
Because the market's always going to be towards the typical disabled person, which is like you and me, right? Cognitively able, physically able for the most part, more so than other people. The market's going to cater towards us, the typical, right? Those most like those who are in power. And so something else, some change to the whole system has to happen to make it more fair for everybody. The scales are already tilted is the point. This isn't like the natural state of things, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so that third model should make us realize most of all that those of us who are kind of don't really see the world this way, we only are sort of blind to that because the scales are tilted in our favor and we just see privilege as being the natural state of things.
Right, exactly. And I think in relation to that, I'm glad you brought up the market, because what I would ultimately argue is that I think the entire concept of disability itself derives from its relation, our relations as humans to fit within the demands of the market. And so you are disabled insofar as you can't contribute to the market. And really, this is why in our societies we don't have a place for the elderly. You know, they're either these cute things that we pity or that we sort of think are really sweet. Oh, they're cute, they're great. Or they're burdens on society. Stick them in an old folks' home and just let them die. You know, the person with Down syndrome, same thing. Oh, we can kind of paternalistically pity this person or take care of this person, but ultimately they can't produce for the market. So, you know, they're a burden on society. And yeah, but I still love them because you don't want to feel like a bad post-evangelical person for saying that this person's a burden, right? So then you get Iceland where they're like, hey, listen, we recognize that this is a drain on society, so we have our solution. Let's kind of circumvent the problem all along, and let's try to make sure that this burden doesn't really exist in our midst. And so again, I think all of this derives from a sort of logic of the market, and that is the ultimate problem, is if we start viewing humans as commodities that can only have value insofar as they produce at a certain demand that meets up with the speed of the market, if that's how we determine what humanity is, then we have a serious problem with understanding how we can build a society that would embrace the other, that would embrace difference. And that's why we need to kind of transform the market logic that determines our social relations.
Yeah, and I want to make clear that I don't think either of us is saying that we should put pressure on women to have babies that are not, non-neurotypical, or that's abortion should be illegal or anything like that. But just to say we should before we start making sort of decisions culturally about how we want to address these issues, we should discuss what kind of society we want to have in the end. Like, what's the goal
Yes.
in the big picture? And that can help us dictate what kind of questions, what kind of steps we can take in the meantime to get to that. Because if we don't ask those questions, then we think very short-term about individual families' lives, and then we don't get causation right. We don't get the whole schema of what causes suffering and how to alleviate it in the first place correct. And I think that's probably where the Icelandic model goes a little awry.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm glad you said that because that's the pitfall is that someone could say then, okay, we don't live in that world. So then are you therefore kind of placing a guilt onto, a woman who does choose to make this decision by saying that somehow she's not living according to this post-market communist logic or something like that?
Which is super easy for us to say.
Right, exactly. And no, that's not what I'm saying. I think we're kind of trying to have a much larger scale engagement with this issue and kind of it's more diagnostic than it is prescriptive. I mean, when you talk about prescriptive and what the fuck to do, oh, motherfucker, I don't know. I mean, this is one of the issues that I think with this article is that he a little bit, and I'm glad that he engaged with this, but Kaposi, is that what it is? He a little bit seemed to kind of take that sort of paternalistic perspective, right? That was like, I am in a capacity to take care of a person that needs to be taken care of. We had already decided that we were going to bring this child into our family prior to getting the diagnosis. And so based on sort of like the actual future principle, we kind of had already bestowed personhood onto the child in our acceptance of the child in the coming months here. And so because of that, there was no turning back for us. We were, of course, going to welcome Chris, is the little boy's name, I think, right? Was it Chris?
I do not remember, actually.
Or damn it, I can't remember. Or was his name Chris? I don't remember. But the little boy, of course, we're going to welcome. Chris. Okay, but of course, we're going to welcome him into our household at this point. But I wonder, is there just a little bit too much of like it's a little too individualistic rather than looking at the social issues, right? I mean, it's an interesting article. I think it's thought-provoking. I admire him for kind of speaking out against or towards like such a sensitive topic. But I do think it's important to kind of have these bigger social discussions, and that's why I think it's good that we are talking about it in this context.
Yeah, agreed. And it's Aaron Kaposi, by the way. Just put that out there.
Oh, his name, the author's name is?
No, the kid's name.
The kid's name is Aaron. Okay, Aaron. Yeah. So Aaron. Yeah, and then I think there was, and I know we're kind of going long on this, but there's something really interesting too. Remember, there was a woman that she had like a viral video that she did with James Franco, where she talked about like an argument for abortion based on this actual future principle. She's a scholar, a philosopher at Princeton. Do you remember I shared it with you, her argument?
I don't remember that.
So I don't remember what the argument was in full, but I remember this idea of she was trying to look at, kind of arguing for abortion from within a sort of philosophical framework. And one of the things that she tackled is that, okay, so if abortion isn't problematic, then why is it the case that some women do experience kind of a traumatic experience after having the abortion? And she says part of it is because of this problem of the actual future principle, which she also thinks explains the point at which a fetus becomes a person as well. But it's this idea of once the fetus has been granted status based on the sort of decision of the parents to bring the fetus into the community, then personhood has been granted onto the fetus. And at that point, that explains why the mother would experience the traumatic loss of a person rather than the loss of a fetus, because that mother has kind of actualized based on this future projection that it was a person and started planning about, who the child would be and thinking about their high school graduation and their marriage. And so those things kind of come along in the fantasizing or the imagination of the parents. And so then the loss of the child is traumatic because it has been a child. It has been bestowed personhood or childhood. But prior to that bestowal of personhood or childhood, there's an indeterminate state of the fetus, and it hasn't been granted that status yet. And I thought there was something really interesting because the author, Chris Kaposi, one of the things he talks about is, of course, we were going to bring Aaron to birth because we had already kind of decided that we would. And so there was this actualization of this future projection of the imagined life that this child would have. The only issue for them is a sort of transformation or a reorientation to what their expectations were based on their projection of that actual future ideal. And I think that's something that's interesting as well to think through. Not that actually helps us with prescription or normative ideas. I just thought it was really interesting to think through.
Yeah, that could be an interesting idea to deal with in the future. It would seem to me the big issue would be how different that is than how we usually talk about these issues, which is about rights, which is a very individualistic sort of natural law way of thinking about it. Whereas this, what did you call it? The future what principle?
I think it's called like the actual future principle.
Yeah, that seems a very different way of thinking about personhood. But that's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. That's a whole other can of worms, indeed. But yeah, I mean, interesting article, interesting to think through. And I think what we're trying to say more than anything is that this is a societal issue, right? That if we could start thinking in these larger frames of how we can build a society that embraces difference and that allows for difference to flourish, that's what's missing in a lot of these discussions. And we should try to kind of basically, we're saying communism will win. Let's tear down the fucking market logic. That's basically what we're saying in a roundabout way.
That's what Austin's saying, everybody.
Oh.
I want to have a job in the future, so.
Okay. Well, yeah. I'm hoping to make that. I'm still holding out for that fuck you podcast money. So then we can say whatever we want. All right, cool. Well, let's move on to our next segment, which is our Sticky Leaves segment. This week we got an interesting Sticky Leaves. It's a long-ass article that Troy sent me. That he said, man, we should talk about this on the podcast. And he's like, it might be a little too niche, though. He's like, I'm not sure that anybody else other than me would appreciate it. But it is about some of the more recent reactionary and fascist tendencies that have emerged within the metal community. And so the article looks at the history of metal as being transgressive, how it emerged, how it used certain satanic symbolism to kind of further that transgression in a different way than maybe like what Black Sabbath was doing. And then it kind of talks more about then how not having a target from which to distance oneself then has created this situation of malaise or ennui that has allowed for the emergence of this reactionary or fascism to kind of emerge within the metal community. And then it kind of proposes what we can do about it. And so Troy, talk about this article. Who wrote it? Why'd you? I mean, this is like,
is this
look
your
at the
sticky
smile.
leaves or my sticky leaves?
You should see the smile on his face right now. Oh, okay. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just gave a broad summary, man. What's the article? Tell us about it.
Okay, so the article's from a website called Toilet of Hell, which is, if you know anything about extreme music media outlets, that's a pretty normal, disgusting way of entitling things.
Do you follow this outlet normally?
No, I had never. Most extreme music media organizations are really terrible, so I don't really follow any of them for the most part.
Oh, okay.
But I'd never heard of this organization until now. And the article is called Rock Against Anything, How Metal Became So Fucking Reactionary and What to Do About It. It's a pretty terrible title, but that's to be expected from metal communities, I think. It's by a guy named R.M. Tiemann, who I have no idea who he is. But what I really appreciated about the article is, having grown up in a lot of ways in the metal community, and being an adult now and sort of finding the vast majority of it pretty stupid. And even when I was a teenager, I thought most of it was pretty stupid. I always tell people who wonder why I'm an academic, but I like metal, that 95% of everything in metal is bad and terrible and stupid, but the 5% is worth it.
Do you have to wade through? The struggle
makes it worth it.
Like, do you wade through the 95%, or do you have you got a good filtration system? Okay.
I have a very good filtration system in mind. Yeah. And so what I appreciated about this article is that usually when you read stuff that tries to combine cultural critique with extreme music, you get one of two things. Either it's overly academic and it's someone who has no understanding of the history and the evolution and the purpose of extreme music and doesn't understand the sort of social niceties that are involved in extreme music communities, because they are very tight-knit niche communities with extremely developed logics of how things work, what things are good, etiquettes, codes of behavior, all these things. It's sort of just assumed that they're just a bunch of like bros who just bro out really hard and never actually think about anything. And they do bro out pretty hard and they drink a lot. So that sort of puts like a limit on the amount of thinking you can do. But there's still a lot of thinking. People are very dedicated to these things, and so they put a lot of work into it. So you either have that side, and so it's not terribly helpful because it's overly simplistic, or you have the other side, which is people from within the community try and think from within their own community, and they're usually not very good at it. It's usually rationalizations of people's behaviors. It's oftentimes just like an excusiology for the sort of leading lights of the community. And it's just not helpful really at all. This article sort of avoids both of those pitfalls. Like it avoids the Scylla and the Charybdis. And it's by a guy who's actually like a vocalist, I think, in a couple of bands that are kind of small scale bands. I've never heard of them. But he also clearly has an understanding of some basic social critique. And that's pretty rare in this genre. So I really appreciated that. And I don't want to belabor it too much because I know most people won't find this very interesting. But the basic idea is that metal in its beginning, so you think about like Black Sabbath, right? That's usually the touchstone for the beginning of metal, comes from disaffected white youth. Middle class, northern England, bombed out Birmingham. That's the origins of metal, right? And people who grew up middle class and have no future. And they're dealing with that malaise by taking things that are kind of reactionary, like Sabbath did with Satanism and occult imagery and stuff like that. But then if you look at Sabbath's actual music, and especially the lyrics that Geezer Butler produced, not Ozzy Osbourne, because he's kind of an idiot. Geezer Butler, the bassist, wrote the lyrics. They have a lot to do with sort of social critique of war, critique of imperialism, critique of economic equality, maybe not in those terms, but coming from the perspective of somebody from a sort of bombed out Birmingham perspective. And they moved even further into that as they progressed. Before their like mid-70s, all we do now is coke period. And then Ozzy Osbourne's descent into being a babbling animal. And a lot of 80s metal took that to its extremes. The article even mentions a lot of the touchstones. Slayer talked not so much about Satanism in their heyday. They talked a lot more about war, imperialism, and the horrors that exist on Earth, not in hell. Megadeth, Metallica, and Anthrax, the big 80s metal bands, did the same. Even the smaller scale bands, there's a lot of sort of radical leftist bands, like Nuclear Assault. The grindcore movement was kind of taking a lot of the leftist politics from punk and using that. Obviously, the hardcore that turns into metal in the 80s took a lot of the leftist politics from punk rock in the late 70s. And you have a lot of like really good engagement with social critique and saying, hey, the reactionary sound that we have can be pretty well married to a critique of the dominant order. Those things mesh really well as far as content of music and content of lyrics. And it's no surprise that the best metal came in the 80s, I think, at least. Ignoring the hair metal phase, which is a totally different thing. And the author's thesis is that once sort of the 90s come around and a lot of in the sort of the mainstream of metal, right? Pantera becomes big. They have number one album. Metallica cuts their hair and becomes normalized and changes their sound to be much more streamlined. You have a change where it's no longer Christianity that's the bad guy, because no one really gives a shit anymore. And he talks a lot about Norwegian black metal, and Christianity is the big bad guy there. It's no longer about the right wing censorship, the PMRC and stuff like that. That's the big bad guy. That was the case right in the 80s and early 90s. But then late 90s, early 2000s, now the bad guy is really the censorship coming from the left, sort of the monoculture, right? The one thing that the left and the right in America agree on is you got to be somewhat politically correct, at least before 2016. And so the big bad guy then becomes this monoculture. And so metal has it's looking for a reactionary content to marry its reactionary sound. And that content comes from being as politically incorrect as possible. And that can be anything from, really kind of easy and soft stuff like Insane Clown Posse, maybe, if you consider that extreme music. Probably not. To the more recent stuff, which is like literal reactionary fascism and Nazism and white supremacy that exists in some metal today. And a lot of people in the communities kind of dismiss it and say it's just a small segment. It's not a big deal. It's very niche and harmless and whatever. I don't think that's true. I think it actually is a bit of a problem. I don't think that it's going to take over the whole community or anything, but it's there. It's kind of like how punk in the early 80s and even to the early 90s had a Nazi problem, a skinhead problem. It wasn't all of punk. It certainly wasn't the majority of punk, but it was there, and there was a reason why it was there. Because the sort of American skinhead Nazism saw itself as sort of a small scale movement against the status quo. And that kind of real vague sense can be married to left-wing ideology as easily as it can be married to right-wing ideology, as it was in punk rock. So anyway, that's a whole lot of like explaining. I would just encourage anybody who's at all interested in these issues to go check out the article. Again, Toilet of Hell is the publication. It's called Rock Against Anything. And if you're even more interested, I would say go check out all that great stuff from the 80s as your touchstone, because there's a lot of good social and political critique that exists in metal and hardcore and punk in the 80s that no one heard a lot about because it was underground. And there weren't streaming platforms to find this stuff on. So that's where all the good stuff is. Yeah,
I mean, this is not my wheelhouse at all, but I still found the article extremely fascinating. Obviously, I'm interested in cultural theory and cultural critique, but it was really interesting to see a sort of niche discussion argument of something that people, I think, are also seeing at a larger scale, right? So people are talking about the rise of the alt-right and the rise of, neo-Nazis and the rise of authoritarianism worldwide. I mean, in Italy's last election, the two parties that received the most votes in parliament are like a xenophobic party and a center-right party, right? Which hadn't been the case. And you see the rise of right-wing parties in Hungary and in Poland and in the Netherlands and even in the UK, in France. You do see it a little bit in the UK, but not so much. But I was thinking in France with Marie Le Pen's party, coming down in the presidential elections, coming down in the final round between her and Macron. So there is this interesting worldwide reactionary tendency that people are talking about. And I think a lot of times when we think of like the large scale like that, it almost seems unmanageable, and it seems like these big boogeymen, and we don't really know what to think, and who are these people, and how can they all be coordinated? They can't all be coordinated, and they're not coordinated, and it's not a conspiracy theory. That would be the conspiracy theory mindset, but it's more of looking at there's a tendency of individuals to respond to certain monocultural tendencies, and it's really nice to see it articulated at the small scale because, one, I think it's more manageable, and it makes sense because you get like a really clear historical exploration, and I don't have any way of critiquing this article because I don't know enough about the bands. I don't know enough about the history of metal. I don't know, but I am familiar enough with some of the historical tendencies that map onto the mirror activities that took place in the metal community. So it was really interesting, I think, to kind of look through and then think about, okay, how does this exist as a sort of microcosm of, broader struggles or concerns in the world today that are dominating the news cycle?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting to think about. And I think that kind of what you're bringing up there is an important point that I think needs to be clarified, is that, and the article does a good job making this point, I think. When you understand sort of the genealogy of these things, what causes incipient fascist movements, right-wing movements, even on these small scales that are not that powerful, like in a metal community, and they really have no say in the political sphere, right? These things are happening the world over, and they're having these little ripples in different little niche communities. And the reason is that the real big bad guy are the things that the 80s metal bands really understood, which is imperialism and economic inequality and the sort of abandonment of urban communities. And those things affected black and brown people in America much, much more than they affected the middle-class white kids who became metalheads. But the very fact that it did affect them so strongly should tell you how much worse it is for most other people. And of course, you can look at hip-hop and see that's everywhere, right? It's incredibly obvious, even in the mainstream in like the 90s. So when you view it that way, I think it's really helpful to say, hey, there are lines of flight there. There are like tools to be used to take any sort of artistic form, creative form, and use it to make a better world. Even putting on corpse paint and like running through the woods and playing unlistenable music with way too much reverb, like can be a social critique. Like it can actually do that, or it can be used to further alienate people in society and let them fall down a pit of hatred and despair. And it's really how we decide to use it that makes a difference between those two outcomes.
Yeah, so without getting too theoretical, I was doing just a little bit of like watching some YouTube videos, and I was being reminded of a philosopher named Alain Badiou, who both Troy and I have dipped in and out of a little bit over the years. And one of the things he talks about is, so what is the difference between a sort of like a reactionary uprising like Nazism versus something like the French Revolution? Badiou wants to say that the French Revolution is what he would call an historical event. It is an event, a truth event that erupts into an existing paradigm, and it kind of disrupts it in such a way that it transforms the trajectory, if you will, of history or of politics, and it transforms it in a different way. So why is the French Revolution an event, but the emergence of Nazism and the Holocaust not an event? And it goes down to this, and it maps onto this as well. So why is the reactionary disposition of the alt-right or neo-Nazism or fascism, even in the microcosms, why are these not events? Whereas something like maybe the explosion of the Beat movement, would that have been an event? As the author talks about, maybe that would have been an event. And the reason would be because events have to be universal, and they can't be limiting. They have to be universal. And precisely the definition of fascism or reactionaryism is that it is not universal. It is a reaction to this sort of fear of the chaos of the beyond. And so they need to control, and they need to kind of bring back together and re-coordinate so that they can fit within their own symbolic matrix, so that they don't feel that sense of loss that they've been toiling with. Whereas the universal is kind of saying, no, let's embrace, let's be faithful to that loss, because it creates a universal transformation moving forward. So there's essentially a nostalgia, a conservative nostalgia that characterizes fascism and the reactionary tendency that doesn't exist within the sort of Badiouian idea of the universal. And so that's why I think we can kind of think about this. And that's what's interesting at the end of the article. The author talks about these strategies then moving forward that I was like, oh, this is why Troy loves this article, because you have talked a lot about how, like, hey, the revolution will not take place over Twitter. It's not going to take place over debates on Facebook. It's about like organizing local communities and being with humans in real life, IRL, so to speak, right? And I think that kind of maps onto some of the programs that he suggests at the end of being a part of a metal community and writing better lyrics and things like that. They all seem to kind of be echoes or shadows of this idea of a universal, because they're trying to remain faithful. There's a fidelity that he's trying to articulate to these past movements, to the Beat movement, to the idea of community organizing, which comes out of, a sort of radical eruption of the communist revolution to create these ideas. So he's almost articulating a sort of Badiouian program without intentionally doing so. Does that make sense, or is that am I pushing it?
No, I totally thought the same thing in our obviously geeky, unnecessary philosophical way of connecting things that don't connect. No, but I think you're right though, and as you're saying that, I'm definitely putting the pieces together, and all the stuff at the end of the article that's talking about strategies, those are all very vague and very kind of obvious. But I think the overall point is so important. Part of the reason this has gotten a lot of publicity lately is that Antifa has been deplatforming metal bands that have any association with reactionary movements, and a lot of these metal bands, a lot of them really are just doing it because they're trying to shock people. Like, that's the history of metal, right? Is a reactionary sound. And you need a reactionary content to go with that. It used to be Satanism. That doesn't scare anybody anymore. So you know what does? Fucking swastikas. And there's a long history of that, right? Bowie did that. Lots of pop stars that are now sort of sanctified did stuff like that. And it's not to excuse them. I don't think we should excuse them. They're kind of idiots. They're definitely idiots. And most of these bands who do this aren't good. They're just trying to do anything to get publicity. But deplatforming them, I don't think helps, because it pisses everybody off. It doesn't engage in constructive dialogue. And these are not people who are in bad faith, for the most part. Especially the fans are not in bad faith. And so I don't think deplatforming people who are in good faith really helps. So instead, go back to that positive vision, that thing that the people actually love, that has that universal tendency. Like I was thinking for metal, it's the riff, right? The riff is like the central node of all metal. Everybody loves the fucking awesome riff. And so you can go back to that and marry that with some good, intelligent content, and people will love it. Like, you could be a fucking transgender whatever. If you can get up there and put up a fucking heavy riff, everyone's going to love you. And so you could do that, and you could make it work.
Right.
Yeah, so that's kind of the basic idea.
Yeah.
I also want to add real quick.
Yeah.
As we're ending the show here, today's 420 as we're recording this. It won't
Not
be
for
when
me.
we release the episode.
I'm a day ahead of you.
It's 421 for you. Yeah, in America where it matters, it's 420. And the great metal band Sleep released a record completely out of the blue that no one knew about today. And if you don't know about Sleep, they are one of the all-time great metal bands. They created the genre known as stoner metal, which is a horrific genre name amongst many horrific genre names.
I don't know. I kind of like it, dude. I kind of like it. It vibes with me more. It doesn't sound so threatening, like death metal, black metal. It's kind of...
That is true, yeah.
I'm kind of happy. I want to hear stoner metal. I'm like, oh, I like it.
It's very California, as all the stoner metal bands came from California for the most part. They created a great record called Dope Smoker back in the late 90s. It has a great history. It didn't get released because it was a 63-minute, I think, one-song album. And their record company refused to release it. It didn't
Wait,
get
how
released
long?
For 63 minutes, I think it is. It's over an hour.
Why did they not? Is that too long?
Because it was one song. And it's
oh, it's one
heavy
song.
as fuck. It's one song. Yeah, it's a 63-minute song.
I think that's amazing.
And it's all about like dudes traveling through like the Arabian desert looking for weed. It's wonderful. Like it's a meditative experience if you listen to it, even if you don't smoke. Like I don't smoke, but it's still meditative. Put some headphones on, listen to some Dope Smoker, and you'll see what the riff is all about.
I'm gonna get high and listen to some Dope Smoker. So the band's
Just
called
make sure you
Sleep.
have good
Okay.
headphones, man.
Other than Sleep, can you give us, like you said, check out some of these 80s bands? Like, because I don't know metal at all, man. I mean, I know, like, hardcore, but it's more like post-punk hardcore shit, you know? So I don't know, like, the pre-punk metal. Or I guess it would still be post-punk. But post-punk metal, let's say. So, like, what are some 80s metal bands?
After the late 70s punk era?
Yeah.
Yeah, so some of these, like, more social critique things I'm talking about. On the more popular end, you have the obvious, like, Metallica's Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning. Those are two all-time great metal albums that are full of this stuff.
Yep.
Megadeth's Rust in Peace and Peace Sells Who's Buying are both in that sort of Reagan era of sort of bewilderment. Anthrax's Among the Living is in that world as well. Did I say Slayer's Rain in Blood?
No, but yeah.
Part of
okay.
that. So Rain in Blood was more like the Satanist sort of trajectory, but their next couple albums, especially Seasons in the Abyss, is much more on the social critique level. Although you find that in Rain and Blood too. I mean, Angel of Death is about the Holocaust.
Oh, damn. Okay.
It's finding horrors in the real world and not just in hell. You want to go for some of the more left field stuff, like Napalm Death is a great example. They're sort of the first grindcore band ever, and they're basically, I think they're like communists or something.
And what is grindcore?
Grindcore is, so it's like hardcore was like punk on steroids, so it's faster, harder, louder than punk was.
More screaming.
So grindcore was like grindcore was to hardcore what hardcore was to punk. So it's hardcore but faster, louder, more metal, unintelligible lyrics, grunting. It doesn't sound good if you don't like it. It's not going to sound good to anybody. But I will say,
okay.
Their old stuff, no one will probably like unless you like that stuff already. But they have a newer album that came out a couple years ago called Apex Predator, I think, which is a really good really good record, even though they've been around for like 25 years or however long it's been. 30 years now. God. So that's just a few things to go
I'm going
check
deep.
out
I'm going deep into metal and
world
stoner
is.
metal and grindcore today.
Yeah, today listen to Dope Smoker, though. That's where it's at.
Okay.
I did to sort of remember the heyday. I went through the whole album while I was doing some work. It was wonderful.
Cool, man. That sounds good to me.
All right, should we sign off here?
I think we should, brother.
Before we do, find us on Twitter, if I can remember our Twitter handle. What is it? @owls_@_Don?
That's
is
the
that
one.
It?
Yes.
I did remember. You can email us at owls@dawnpodcast@gmail.com. And as always, please leave us a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. We'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, and we have some grand plans, hopefully, for the summer to try to be a little bit more consistent with this. Hopefully, in the next week or so, we'll have a special guest, Jared from Wisecrack. If any of you guys follow Wisecrack, is going to come on. But then also in the summer, we're talking about doing, like Troy. I don't know. He thinks that we're going to have all this time to do the podcast. I'm hoping we do. I'm hoping we can stay consistent with it, considering we've done 2 podcasts in the last 6 months. But we'll do some interesting stuff coming up, like going through philosophical texts and things like that, as well as kind of regular episodes as well. So hopefully we are back on a semi-regular, if not fully regular schedule. So stay tuned. Keep checking your platforms or our website or whatever, which is owlsatdawn.com. Is it owlsatdawn.com? Jesus, I forgot. Yes, it is.
It's
owls.
I don't remember it on the website.
It's owlsatdawn.com. So check it out.
It is. I just confirmed it.
It is. It's owlsatdawn.com. I'm also probably going to maybe just be writing random shit for the blog on owlsatdawn.com. And if Troy has time, maybe he can put some of his interesting stuff up there as well. Yeah, sounds good. I love you guys. Watch out for those flying bat foxes from hell.
Das Vidania, Amerikanski.